The military history of Japan is characterized by a long period of clan warfare until the 12th century AD, followed by feudal wars which culminated in military governments known as shogunate. Feudal militarism transitioned to imperial militarism in the 19th century, after the landings of Admiral Perry and the elevation of the Meiji Emperor, leading to rampant imperialism until Japan's defeat by the Allies in World War II. The occupation of Japan marks the inception of modern Japanese military history with the drafting of a new constitution, prohibiting the ability to wage war against other nations. Prehistory. Recent archaeological research has uncovered traces of wars as far back as the Jomon period between the various tribes existing on the Japanese archipelago. Some theorists believe that shortly after the Yayoi period, horse riders from the Korean peninsula invaded southern Kyushu, then spread all the way to northern Honshu. This is when horse riding and iron tools were first introduced to the islands. Jomon Period. Near the end of the Jomon period, villages and towns became surrounded by moats and wooden fences due to increasing violence within or between communities. Some remains were found with head and arrow injuries. Battles were fought with weapons like the sword, sling, spear, and bow and arrow. Yayoi period. Bronze goods and bronze-making techniques from the Asian mainland reached what is now Japan as early as the 3rd century BC. It is believed that bronze and later iron implements and weapons were introduced to Japan near the end of this time. Archaeological findings suggest that bronze and iron weapons were not used for war until later, particularly at the beginning of the Yamato period, as the metal weapons found from the remains do not show were consistent with use as weapons. The transition from the Jomon to Yayoi, and later to the Yamato period, is likely to have been characterized by violent struggle as the natives were soon displaced by the invaders and the vastly superior military technology. Historian John Kuhn believes that a possible partial genocide of Japan's Aboriginal people occurred during this period. Around this time, Sangwoji first referred to the nation of Wa. According to this work, Wa was divided into more than 100 tribes, and for some 70 or 80 years there were many disturbances and warfare. About 30 of the communities had been united by a sorceress queen named Himiko. She sent an emissary named Nishim with a tribute of slaves and cloth to Daifang in China, establishing diplomatic relations with Kauai, ancient and classical Japan. By the end of the 4th century, the Yamato clan was well settled on the Nara plain with considerable control over the surrounding areas. The 5 kings of Wa sent envoys to China for the dominion of the Japanese islands. The Nippon Shoki described that Yamato was even strong enough to have sent an army against the powerful state of Goguryeo. Yamato Japan had close relations with the southwestern Korean kingdom of Baekje. In 663, Japan, supporting Baekje, was defeated by the allied forces of Tang China and Silla in Korean peninsula. As a result, the Japanese were banished from the Korean peninsula. To defend the Japanese archipelago, a military base was constructed in Dazaifu, Fukuoka of Kyushu. Yamato period. Ancient Japan had close ties with the Ga Confederacy in the Korean peninsula, as well as with the Korean kingdom of Baekje. Ga exported abundant quantities of iron armor and weapons to Wa, and there may have even been a Japanese military post there with Ga and Baekje. Cooperation. In 552, the ruler of Baekje appealed to Yamato for help against its enemies, the neighboring Silla. Along with his emissaries to the Yamato court, the Baekje king sent bronze images of Buddha, some Buddhist scriptures, and a letter praising Buddhism. These gifts triggered a powerful burst of interest in Buddhism. The Battle of Baegang took place in 663, near the conclusion of the Korean Three Kingdoms period. The Nippon Shoki records that Yamato sent 32,000 troops and 1,000 ships to support Baekje against the Silla Tang force. However, these ships were intercepted by Silla Tang fleet and defeated. Baekje, without aid and surrounded by Silla and Tang forces on the land, collapsed. A hostile Silla prevented Japan from having any further meaningful contact with the Korean peninsula until far later in time. The Japanese then turned directly to China. Nara period. In many ways, the Nara period was the beginning of Japanese culture becoming what we know today. It was in this period that Buddhism, the Chinese writing system, and law system first became codified in Japan. The country was unified and centralized, and much of the basics of the feudal system were later set down, while much of the discipline, weapons, armor, and technique known of the samurai were not developed yet. The fundamentals of samurai practices had begun, as technologies of mounted archery, swordsmanship, and spear fighting were adopted. Succession disputes were prevalent here, just as in most of the later periods. The Nara period saw the appointment of the first shogun, Otomo no Otomaro. Heir-an period. The Heir-an period, militarily, consisted mainly of conflicts and battles between samurai clans over political power and influence, especially fought over control over the line of succession to the chrysanthemum throne. The imperial family struggled against the control of the Fujiwara clan, which almost exclusively monopolized the post of regent. Feudal conflicts over land, political power, and influence eventually culminated in the Genpei War between the Taira and Minamoto clans, and a large number of smaller clans allied with one side or the other. The end of the Genpei War brought about the end of the Heir-an period and the beginning of the Kamakura period. During this period, samurai were still largely archers, as were before, and several swordsmen. Nearly all duels and battles began with an exchange of arrow fire, before single combat was entered with swords and daggers. The later Heir-an period conflicts, particularly the Genpei War, and the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate that followed, marked the rise of the samurai class over the court nobility. Shogunates, who were essentially military governments, dominated Japanese politics for nearly 700 years, subverting the power of the emperor and that of the imperial court. Militarily speaking, this period also marks a crucial shift from a state that was united in relative peace against outside threats, to one that does not fear invasion and instead focused on internal division and clashes between ruling factions. With the exception of the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, Japan did not face considerable outside threats until the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century. Thus, pre-modern Japanese military history is largely defined not by wars with other states, but by internal conflicts. Feudal Japan. This period is marked by the departure from relatively small or medium-sized clan-like battles, to massive clashes of clans for battle over the control of Japan. In the Kamakura period, Japan successfully repulsed Mongol invasions, and this started a huge growth to armies with samurai as an elite force and commanders. Following roughly 50 years of bitter fight over control of imperial succession, the Muromachi period under the Ashikaga shogunate saw a brief period of peace as the power of the traditional systems of administration of the court gradually declined. Later, the position of the provincial governors and other officials under the shogunate slowly gave way into a new class of daimyo, and thus, bringing the archipelago into a period of 150 years of fractious disunity and war. Kamakura period. Having subdued the rivals, the Nara clan, the Minamoto clan established the Kamakura shogunate, which brought a period of peace. The only battles fought during this period mainly consisted of agents of the Minamoto suppressing rebellions or similar. The Mongols, who controlled China at the time under the Yuan dynasty, attempted to invade Japan twice in the 13th century, marking the important military event of the Kamakura period, and two of the very few invasion attempts upon Japan. In early October 1274, the Battle of Bunei began with a combined force of Mongols and Koreans seizing Tsushima and then attacking Kyushu, landing at Akata Bay. On October 19, the Mongols lost many battleships due to typhoon and the remaining troops retreated. Anticipating a second assault, the shogunate organized the construction of walls and fortresses along the shore, and gathered forces to defend against further invasions. A second invasion attempt was made in 1281. In what has come to be known as the Battle of Koen, the Mongol-led forces retreated after losing many ships again due to a typhoon. The equipment, tactics, and military attitudes of the samurai and the Mongol opponents differ greatly, and while both invasions failed miserably, their impact on developments and changes in samurai battle were quite significant. The samurai remained attached to ideas of single combat, that of honorable battle between individual warriors, and to certain ritual elements of battle, such as a series of archery exchanges conducted before entering into hand-to-hand fighting. The Mongols, of course, knew nothing of Japanese conventions, and were arguably much more organized in the strike tactics. They did not select individual opponents with whom to conduct honorable duels, but rode forth on horseback, with various forms of gunpowder weapons and the now famous Mongol bow, charging into enemy lines and killing as many as they could without regard to Japanese conceptions of protocol. Though archery and mounted combat were central to Japanese warfare as well at this time, the Mongols remain famous even today for the prowess in these matters. The ways samurai tactics and attitudes were affected directly by these experiences, and their extent, are of course difficult to ascertain, but were certainly significant. Muromachi period. The shogunate fell in the wake of the 1331 Genko War, an uprising against the shogunate organized by the Emperor Go-Daigo. After a brief period under true imperial rule, the Ashikaga shogunate was established in 1336, and a series of conflicts known as the Nanboku-cho Wars began. For over 50 years, the archipelago became embroiled in disputes over control of imperial succession, and thus over the country. Battles grew larger in this period, and were less ritualized, though single combats and other elements of ritual and honorable battle remain. Organized strategies and tactics under military commanders began to emerge, along with a greater degree of organization of formations and divisions within armies. It was in this period as well that weaponsmithing techniques emerged, creating so-called Japanese steel blades, flexible yet extremely hard and sharp. The katana, and myriad similar related blade weapons, appeared at this time and would dominate Japanese arms, relatively unchanged through the mid-20th century. As a result, it was also during this period that the shift of samurai from marches to swordsmen began in a significant way. Sengoku period. Less than a century after the end of the Nanboku-cho Wars, peace under the relatively weak Ashikaga shogunate was destroyed by the outbreak of the Onan War, a roughly 10-year struggle that converted the capital of Kyoto into a battlefield and a heavily fortified city that suffered severe destruction. The authority of both the shogunate and the imperial court had all but weakened, and provincial governors and other local samurai leaders emerged as the daimyo, who would battle each other, religious factions and others for land and power for the next 150 years or so. The period has come to be called Sengoku, after the Warring States period in ancient Chinese history. Over 100 domains clashed and warred throughout the archipelago as clans rose and fell, boundaries shifted, and some of the largest battles in all of global pre-modern history were fought. A great many developments and significant events took place during this period, ranging from advances in castle design to the advent of the cavalry charge, the further development of campaign strategies on a grand scale, to the significant changes brought on by the introduction of firearms. Army compositions changed and grew more strategic. Masses of ashigaru foot soldiers, armed with long lances, served a role alongside mounted samurai, archers, and later, gunners. Siege tactics and weaponry were exceedingly rare until the modern era. Naval battles likewise consisted of little more than using boats to move troops within range of bow or arquebus, and then into hand-to-hand fighting. The Hojo clan, in and around the Kanto area, were among the first to establish networks of satellite castles, and the complex use of these castles both for mutual defense and coordinated attacks. The Takeda, under Takeda Shingen, developed the Japanese equivalent of the cavalry charge, though debate continues today as to the force of his charges, and the appropriateness of the term, comparing them to Western cavalry charges. It is evident from contemporary sources that it was a revolutionary development, and powerful against defenders unused to it. Battles of particular interest or significance are too numerous to list here, but suffice it to say that this period saw a myriad of strategic and tactical developments, and some of the longest sieges and largest battles in the history of the pre-modern world. Azuchi Momoyama period. This period, named for the increasingly important castle cities, is marked with the introduction of firearms, after contact with the Portuguese, and a further push towards all-out battle, away from individual combats and the influences of concepts of personal honor and bravery. The arquebus was introduced to Japan in 1543, by Portuguese on board a Chinese ship that crashed upon the tiny island of Tanegashima in the southernmost parts of the Japanese archipelago. Though their introduction was not seen to have particularly dramatic effects for several decades, by the 1560s, thousands of gunpowder weapons were in use in Japan, and began to have revolutionary effects upon Japanese battle tactics and strategies, army compositions, and castle architecture. The 1575 Battle of Nagashi, in which about 3,000 arquebusiers led by Oda Nobunaga cut down charging ranks of thousands of samurai, remains one of the chief examples of the effect of these weapons. Highly inaccurate, and taking a long time to reload, arquebuses, or teppo as they are called in Japanese, did not win battles on their own. Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and other commanders developed tactics that honed arquebus use to the greatest advantage. At Nagashi, Nobunaga's gunners hid behind wooden barricades, embedded with large wooden spikes to ward off cavalry, and took turns firing volleys and reloading. As in Europe, the debilitating effects of wet gunpowder were decisive in a number of battles. But one of the key advantages of the weapon was that, unlike bows, which required years of training largely available only to the samurai class, guns could be used by relatively untrained footmen. Samurai stuck to the swords and the bows, engaging in cavalry or infantry tactics, while the ashigaru wielded demanded the guns. Some militant Buddhist factions began to produce firearms in the foundries normally employed to make bronze temple bells. In this manner, the Ukiyo-e, a group of monks and lay religious zealots, turned the Ishiyama Honganji Cathedral fortress into one of the most well-defended fortresses in the country. The Iki and a handful of other militant religious factions thus presented significant powers unto themselves, and fought fierce battles against some of the chief generals and samurai clans in the archipelago. Though Sengoku battles continued to rage as they had for the previous century, growing larger and more tactically complex, it was at this time that the many warring states began to be united, first under Oda Nobunaga, then under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally by Tokugawa Ieyasu. In 1592 and 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi organized a 160,000 army and navy for the conquest of China's Ming dynasty by way of Korea, after the latter's refusal to allow Japanese forces to march through. Japan completed the occupation of a Korean peninsula in 3 months. However, a Chinese army was sent to a Korean peninsula at the behest of the Korean king. Eventually, the supply lines of the Japanese army became overstretched until it became impossible for the Japanese army to maintain the occupation of a Korean peninsula. After Hideyoshi's death, the Council of Five Elders ordered the remaining Japanese forces in Korea to retreat. Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of the regents, took control of most of the former leader's forces. In 1600, he won the Battle of Sekigahara and solidified his rule. In 1603, he received the title of shogun, making him the nominal ruler of the entire country. Edo period. This period was one of relative peace under the authority of the Tokugawa shogunate. This was a forced peace, maintained through a variety of measures that weakened the daimyo and ensured the loyalty to the shogunate. The Tokugawa peace was ruptured only rarely and briefly prior to the violence that surrounded the Meiji Restoration of the 1860s. The Siege of Osaka, which took place in 1614 to 1615, was essentially the last gasp for Toyotomi Hideyori, heir to Hideyoshi, and an alliance of clans and other elements who opposed the shogunate. A samurai battle on a grand scale, in terms of strategy, scale, methods are employed, and the political causes behind it. This is widely considered the final conflict of the Sengoku period. Outside of the Siege of Osaka and the later conflicts of the 1850s-60s, violence in the Edo period was restricted to small skirmishes in the streets, peasant rebellions, and the enforcement of maritime restrictions. Social tension in the Edo period brought a number of rebellions and uprisings, the largest of which was the 1638 Shimabara Rebellion. In the far north of the country, the island of Hokkaido was inhabited by Ainu villagers and Japanese settlers. In 1669, an Ainu leader led a revolt against the Matsuma clan who controlled the region, and it was the last major uprising against Japanese control of the region, and was put down in 1672. In 1789, another Ainu revolt, the Minashi-Kunisha Rebellion, was crushed. The appearance of gunboat diplomacy in Japan in the 1850s, and the forced so-called opening of Japan by Western forces underscored the weaknesses of the shogunate and led to its collapse. Though the actual end of the shogunate and establishment of an imperial government with Western style was handled entirely peacefully, through political petitions and other methods, the years surrounding the event were not an entirely bloodless. Following the formal termination of the shogunate, the Bosch and War was fought in 1868 to 1869 between the Tokugawa army and a number of factions of nominally pro-imperial forces.